Hello and welcome everybody for another Tour de Tools. Tour de Tools is a show where we host very interesting guests from the data community at large, and where we typically discuss tools, frameworks within the data community. I'm gonna leave it to Gauthier to introduce our guest.
Yeah, so welcome everyone. So today we're welcoming James. So James is calling us from North Carolina in the United States. He's the CTO at Superconductive. For those of you who don't know, Superconductive is the company behind greatexpectations and will be the main topic of today. James has been active in the data field for over 15 years. He spent a good portion of that working at the US federal government. And today you will be speaking about great expectations. On that note, James, welcome.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
Yeah, I'm very excited to talk about great expectations.
Yeah, same here.
I think both me and Gauthier are big fans, and we've been following it and using it very actively over the last months.
We're actually using it in a few projects.
You know, it's amazing to me how much the community has really driven great expectations. When we first started the project, there was basically a recognition among kind of a couple of people that we had talked to that this is a common problem across different fields, across different groups, but we didn't have any sense for just how engaged we'd be able to build a community around the project. And that's absolutely been my favorite part about getting to do this, is seeing how much we can get community engagement. And I think there's just a lot of ground left to cover in terms of what we can build, which is always, of course, a really exciting place to be.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
I think, you know, as we're going through this conversation, what I'd love to do is, share a screen for a little bit and kind of talk through great expectations. Cause I think, you know, a lot of people are obviously familiar with the project, but a lot of people aren't yet. And I want to kind of frame how we think about data quality, because I think that really brings a lot of useful context to how to use the tool and how to integrate it into other workflows. And then I'm hoping you all can just ask questions along the way, and we can really turn it into a good organic discussion.
Just quick note on that. Like, feel free for people looking at it on YouTube to actually send questions there, and we'll pick them up.
Yeah, look forward to that. Absolutely. You mentioned Superconductive. I kind of want to start off by just giving. Let me make sure I get just giving a little bit about us. So. You gave me a great introduction. Thank you. I specifically, you know, when you talk about being in the data field, one thing I would flag is that has absolutely not always been quantitative data. So my background originally academically was math and philosophy. Did a lot of computer science, but I've also been very, very interested from the beginning in how we apply data insights to real world problems. You mentioned I spent a long time in the U.S. federal government, and you know I got to do some really interesting problem spaces. You know, work on political modeling and other kinds of things that are high impact, but also that are you know, in many cases very, very low data environments. And being able to find out how we can blend the very, you know, qualitative and subjective insights from people together with other kinds of data systems has been a long-term passion of mine. Superconductive is growing. We are fully remote. We're really actively hiring right now, by the way. I don't know if I'm allowed to give that plug, but I'll give that plug. Love to hear from people who are interested in joining our team. We've got a really great group of people. This is like our typical day in the office, is this kind of a Zoom call, as you can see on the right. A lot of the team started out actually in as data engineers, and specifically we originally had a lot of people whose background was in healthcare, but that's actually changing a lot as we've really kind of moved the company to focus on great expectations and on making the product better and finding ways that we can really advance the data quality ecosystem. So that's just it's been super fun for me to get to be part of the team. So what I wanted to cover today is just like a little bit about, as I mentioned, the kind of data quality landscape, our approach to thinking about that and working on that, as well as where we're going. All right. I think this is one of those slides that's a surprise to no one, but yet it's like very good. It's like at the beginning of every math class, we start off with 1 + 1 = 2. Data workflows today are a mess. And there's a lot of different reasons that is the case. And it's not always the case, right? There's a lot of systems that work really, really well. Don't get me wrong. But the thing is, like, we want data pipelines to grow and evolve, like by their nature, that are not static, because that's how we get new value. And that means that they're constantly changing. When they change, there's failures that can often be very subtle. And the reason goes back to the question, like the comment that we were talking about just a second ago of what a data system is. It's because in order to know that a data system has gone wrong, it requires much more than a technical understanding of the system. It's really about the semantics of the data itself, right? Like, you might still be getting numbers that come out of a machine learning model, but if they're fundamentally flawed because the data that you're computing against now no longer matches your training data, then the system, I would say, is broken. But it's just not broken in a way that's obvious. Another kind of symptom of this challenge in data workflows now is that there's all sorts of people who understand things about how a system works, and there's very little effective means to bring together all of their knowledge. We call that the tacit knowledge problem. So lots of people, when they sit down at, say, a notebook to build a new system or build a model or do some transformation, they start off with, as you would expect, and as you should, a lot of exploratory analysis, developing a really rich model of the data. But often that model is just a mental model. So a lot of what we're interested in is figuring out how to capture that mental model that people have. Maintenance on data systems is all the things: time-consuming, expensive, and morale-killing. I still remember one of my very first big data systems that I was working on, spending untold numbers of hours trying to figure out how to, address race conditions on batch load jobs in Hadoop, which obviously dates me for how long ago that was. but man, it's expensive. It just takes a lot of engineer time to do. And as a result of those things, it's hard to keep documentation up to date. It's hard to make sure people trust them. One of the things that I think is really interesting in terms of how we think about this problem, and this gets into some of the things that are really exciting to me for how data quality moves, is that I think there's a wide variety of classes of problem, and I want to propose that as we're thinking about this problem today, we think about two big categories. One I'll call pipeline risks, and another data risks. And the reason to separate them, hopefully, will become obvious. The first one, this kind of picture that I put up in the top left, and this is a picture that we used in a lot of early talks about great expectations, about the growth of data pipelines, that over time they get deeper, they get wider, they get thicker. The problem there is that diagnosing problems becomes very difficult, because at any given node, almost everything is upstream of that node. And so it's very important to figure out, like, if you want to know where something goes wrong, you need ways to pinpoint and diagnose more effectively. Basically, you call an electrician over to your house and you say, there's a problem with this light fixture. Well, they're going to be able to trace the problem back because of diagnostic tools, right? Otherwise, that would be a really hard problem. It's saying this, obviously, as somebody who recently had an electrician at my house. There's, from pipeline risk perspective, there's all kinds of issues of, like, data getting corrupted, outages in data. And those are different from, on the other hand, what I'll call data risks, where, you have things like edge cases or subtle bias in your training data, or undetected trends, data drift, non-stationary distributions, or outliers and things that are, like, inherently very subject, or very semantically tied, as opposed to more functions of the pipeline. So one of the things I would flag is that with Great Expectations, we're really aiming to address both of those. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
To think in the context of these classes, because both are super relevant. We see both in practice, but the pipelines is something that typically something fails. Discovering what happened is typically much harder. Like you need a very well set up system to clearly quickly discover what happened, but at least something failed.
Yes.
Well, with the data risk, it's much harder to notice. It's not that, there are we're going to talk more in depth about great expectations, but there are less best practices out there today to tackle these things. And typically, it also some extent solved more down the line, in a sense, like you have a machine learning model and you're monitoring the performance, and at some point you might see a performance change, and you need to discover by that it's because there is a data quality issue.
Yep,
it's much harder to monitor this.
I totally agree. It's interesting to me that there was a paper written by a bunch of folks at Google. It's been probably more than 5 years ago now, but it's called Hidden Technical Debt in Machine Learning Systems. And they wrote a kind of a shorter version of it as well. And I really like that framing. I view that as actually a really, really good distilled picture of what can go wrong. And they get it into a lot of, really, I think, useful case examples. And one of the reason I put up data horror stories, we've over time sort of elicited and collected from people different examples of ways that these kinds of things go wrong. I mean, and some of them are they sound crazy to anyone but a practitioner, and a practitioner, they're like, oh my gosh, yes, I've seen that exact thing. But things like, somebody put a negative sign in front of a sort order for a machine learning model. And, the thing that I would say, if there's one example that really gave birth to Great Expectations as a project, it was when I was working as a manager of a data science team, and we were really interested in sharing models that we were building. So, pre-trained models. And, obviously when you do that, there is a lot of assumption that's baked into the model, right? Like we're going to assume that the data that you're going to use is in many ways, or in certain critical respects, at least, similar to the data that we trained on. And what we found is that that wasn't always true, for a variety of reasons. Ironically, in some ways, it comes down to training the people, right? Training people to understand what those assumptions are. And what we were looking for is, I said, look, what I want is a way to make it very easy for someone to be able to see whether their data meets the assumptions of our model. Mm-hmm. And when you think about it in those terms, I think it's really nice. Like, it's really easy. Basically, what we're looking for in some ways is something that you put at the top of a notebook you share with a colleague. Like, hey, I know you're gonna use your data. Like, just run this check, right? And so that's a lot of what we do with Great Expectations. Let me. Oh, go ahead.
No, I think there's clearly a need for this, and I think it also shows the quick growth of the community around Great Expectations, that there was a very active need for this, but there was no really the go-to framework to tackle these type of things.
Yeah. It's funny because when I was working in a research element at the time, and I would go around and talk to people and say, like, I want this thing. And a lot of times in research, people say you're building a tool for your past self. That was very true for me. Like, if only I had this, I would have been happy. And at the same time, a lot of what you're doing when you're starting a project is, well, do I really need to do something new here? Like, what else exists? And so I did a lot of research into understanding how people approached this problem in the past. And there's all sorts of, if you go back to Bell Labs, 1960s computer science, people talk about like integrity checks in data, for example. And I think there's really good insights from those kinds of very, early computing models. And yet I think what specifically because of the things that you brought up a little ago, Bart, about the semantic, the data risks, there's also something that was just really an unmet need. And where I think Great Expectations is really useful is that you can sort of grow into more and more features of the tool very naturally. So if you look at let me make sure for people. I don't know if we're jumping ahead too much or where but let me kind of give a little bit of the vocabulary here, and then I'll point out something that's pretty neat to see. So if what does Great Expectations do, right? We've talked about it already. We're bringing automated testing to the data, and when you look at this statement, I think the little bit of syntax here on the screen, I think the thing that's interesting is that the vocabulary, and sometimes I even call it a grammar. The grammar of Great Expectations has been very, very intentionally chosen to be very explicit. Yep. And we're not trying to hide anything about what's happening. Mm-hmm. And in fact, the opposite, we're trying to help you kind of structure your thinking about assumptions that are present in data. And if you kind of start at the top of this, you'll see, okay, well, expect a column to exist. I mean, that feels like such a basic thing. When somebody sees that check, the first thing they say is, oh yeah, I've already written that. Like, I have those checks in my pipeline. And they're right. They do. That's good. I will say that said, almost always, as in all kinds of software, the real technical challenges are hidden, and there's all sorts of edge cases that a tool can help you with that your hand-rolled solution, if that's not what you're trying to focus on, won't necessarily accommodate. But as you kind of move down this list, well, what you observe is that we start off with these basically structural characteristics, like schema-like checks. Mm-hmm. And then you can sort of move in and you can get, okay, there's a little bit of looking at values, like null, values in a range or uniqueness. And then as you get down, eventually you're looking at, for example, KL divergence, distributional characteristics. And what we see is that there's basically a pattern of adoption where lots and lots of people use the column values not to be null. Lots of people use column to exist, and use it a lot. But then as you keep using the tool, or using more pipelines, you can also kind of expand deeper into the vocabulary and use more of the features of the tool. I think there are several other features of using Great Expectations or like characteristics of how we approach the problem that I think is really useful. One is that Great Expectations isn't a pipeline runner, right? It doesn't require you add a lot of infrastructure. You just plug it into whatever you're using. Like I said earlier, it could be as simple as running a cell in a notebook, or you can add into an Airflow pipeline. You could, run on a cron job, right? There's no new infrastructure that you have to add in order to be able to use the Great Expectations tooling. Expectations also compile directly to human readable documentation. And this is, I think, a really, really important point, that you get your documentation for free when you're using Great Expectations. And not just that, it stays up to date, because the documentation, these statements about what should be true, is actually tested against the data. And so you can see, yes, the expectation that this column should exist, but that's still true. The expectation that there are, no more than 0.1% of null values in this column, that's still true. It's also, I think, really important that the language of Great Expectations can be extended. So, I don't know by any means, of course, all of the different custom expectations that people make. over time, I want us to be able to as a community share more. And that's actually one of the things we'll talk about, is that we've really done a lot of work to make it very easy for people.
In the latest releases, right? Yeah. See.
Absolutely. Yeah.
New expectation, that's the interface. It's not really.
I'm really glad. I'd love to talk more about that and like kind of hear some of your experience with it.
But can I jump on something like, so
Yeah.
because you're mentioning, or maybe it's gonna come afterwards, but like, because you were mentioning a bit the landscape, my experience, let's say, with Great Expectations is exactly all these extra features that you get. So of course there is the grammar and everything, and there is the let's say the execution engine, but as I think it's actually stated on the website, like it's batteries included. Which I think is a big, let's say, difference. For example, if you compare to other frameworks, like, I know DQ, for example, is a big one, because for example, we use a lot of Spark in our day-to-day jobs. So I don't know what's a bit your view on that, and how do you come to say, like, okay, let's just do a bit more, let's say, than a library, because it's already up there. But maybe it's coming up in after the presentation.
No, this is a great time, I think, to talk about that, because the way we are thinking about that is that there is a base library, and that's just the beauty of open source, is that that's just always going to be there. And we want, obviously, to make it as powerful as possible. At the same time, there are things that are just very hard to do in an open source project that you, if you also want it to be really easy to set up and deploy and maintain, which we do. So I think we work very, very hard to make the APIs as batteries as included as possible, but also to make them very easy to extend, so that teams that are using Great Expectations can extend it, but also so that we can build on top of it something that offers you more value. I'll give a little hint of that, and just, we don't have a product out there yet, but we are building one, and we're working with a few partners right now that have a bit of where we're giving a little bit more insight into where we're going to go specifically, and I think there's a lot that that gets me very excited as you think about what it means to be batteries included, and then maybe even like what it means to be supercharged, because you can really have a supercharged data quality system. Actually, just to hit that, like, what is the last bullet on here, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that here in just a second, is profiling. I think that's a really powerful direction that we can go, where we've been a little bit slow to deploy things that people like, that are flashy in terms of, for example, anomaly detection and these kind of automated data quality checks. And the reason is that we're very committed to semantic correctness, right? To ensuring that the expectations that you make are the right ones, right? And not to say that there's a right and a wrong, but in the sense that what I like to call it is fit for purpose, right? The expectations should be tied to what you need the data to do, how you want the system to behave. So we've focused a lot on building profilers in such a way that you can customize them, use the results in important, in ways that make sense to you, and also that we can be very, very explicit about what they're doing. Again, I'll come to that here in just a second.
Okay. I was going to say, maybe because I know what profilers do, maybe it's a good small recap on what are profilers inside. Because
I think I actually have. Yeah. I think this is actually kind of an interesting slide for that. And so I'm going to approach it in I guess in two ways. First is this slide is designed to kind of capture how Great Expectations is thinking about an expectation. I think it's really important, like really powerful to think of expectations as questions, right? Everyone's question is like this kind of very somewhat abstract thing, like, is my data right? Like, does it do what I want it to do? Which we can sort of decompose into a variety of other questions, like, does it have nulls that it shouldn't have? Well, if you want to answer that question, you need to say how many values are null? And then from a profiling perspective, how many nulls should it have, right? And so when we're doing a validation in great expectations, they're under the hood. All of these like kind of intermediate nodes here, table.head, table.columns. These are what are called metrics. So we're getting metrics that answer questions, right? That describe data. And then we kind of run this process in reverse for profilers, right? We ask questions ourselves without necessarily knowing the answers, look at metrics, and then use those to guess what the expectations should be.
Yeah. I think maybe from an implementation point of view, it makes a lot of sense to have both, because like if you start in a context where there is a lot of data and you want to build business relevant expectations for everything, I mean, then you're starting off now for the next few years, which is not really realistic. But if you start from profile data, then you at least have a baseline to start from, and then you can improve it from there. And I think that combination is very interesting.
I agree. That's one thing I'm really interested in getting to think through more is how do you sort of marginally update expectations? I'm actually curious for you all, like as you've been using great expectations or as you've adapted expectation suites, how do you find that process of, I guess the way I'd say it is when you get an expectation validation result back, and let's suppose that you have a failed validation, it's still open question. What does that mean? Is the data wrong? Is your expectation wrong? Something else, I'm curious what your response workflow has been as you look at validation results.
Are you asking me personally, or okay? Yeah. So I think what I do, let's say, mostly, unfortunately, on some projects, I'm not using great expectations, but we evaluated it. But what happens there is usually like a lot of business people already know their data pretty well. Like they have a very good idea of what it looks like, and for some of them, for example, they do have a baseline in their head. And I think, like, for example, using great expectations or similar tools like enables you to put this on paper. And I would say, like, so far, my experience is that because we know these assumptions should hold true, it's probably us making a mistake in the implementation, like wrong threshold or wrong column, or and then if that's not the case, then there is, of course, a discussion between or we try to figure it out. But so far, it's been mostly, let's say, business users looking for this because they do need to know, like, okay, for example, like talk about the machine learning model, like we need to make sure that what we're looking at actually makes sense. And so far, a lot of people have been using these, but they are a bit looking at, okay, like, can we automate this so that I'm sure it's always good? And we know that today it should be good. So I would say it's mostly us. I would say us as in data engineers looking at it.
I think it depends a lot on context as well. Like we do projects for small tech startups to very large corporate companies, large multinationals. And typically when you're in the context of a tech startup, it's easy to find the person to have this business logic, this business understanding, like, is my expectation wrong, or is actually something wrong with the data? But on the contrary, in a larger setting, at large corporate companies, you sometimes, like, this can be like a signal of, I'm going to ask somebody, what is this understanding? Hopefully that there is an understanding. That's the first thing. But what you also see then, that sometimes there is work to be done on the, let's say, overarching data governance before you can actually fix something, because perhaps there is no real ownership of this data source. And you get a lot of additional questions that are more than just the data quality or integrity that are being triggered by this expectation, basically.
That both of those answers really resonate with me in terms of how we're facilitating the conversation. One of the things that I think is a really fun use case that I've heard people talk about is basically they use Great Expectations to sort of write the hard email, like dear vendor, you said column X does not have nulls. I don't know why, but this is the report I just got, you know, and it can really, I mean, it can be kind of useful to have that more of like an objective third-party picture into what's going on in the system. And I also think there's another dimension that we didn't talk about just yet, which is like the time through a project. Because when you're first doing a project, you're still, you know, you're learning the data as much as you're learning the project. As time goes on, you know, there's more likely that you can actually, especially if you've had a history of validations, zero in on, well, you know, some upstream data has changed, or we've added a new integration. And that can really, I think, be very useful for zeroing in on that, you know, that business logic, business insight, and making sure that it gets throughout an organization, that everyone has that availability of insight. Actually, that's probably a good point. If I can talk for a second about sort of where I see us going, okay. And that is that for Great Expectations, I think we're going to be doing a lot of the value in what we're, you know, we call this like a cloud product, the cloud Great Expectations, around collaboration. It's really about helping people effectively communicate about expectations, about validations, about code changes, about all of the things that really affect the health of a data system, the quality of data that's coming through something. So, you know, if you look at that first column, the open source, you know, we don't ever want to give up on being the right toolkit, like the open source tool that a data scientist or a data engineer can use as their go-to tool for understanding, describing, validating data. If you're talking then about, well, I'm part of a team, right? Like I need, it's important to me to be able to make sure that I'm not just kind of protecting my own little fiefdom, my own pipeline and getting, you know, making sure I can more effectively communicate outwardly, but it's like, I want to be able to understand how to communicate across my team and how to have a reference place, a site that we can all bookmark and go to and use as the point where we enter into these conversations. And then kind of as you look further into an organization, there are kind of additional needs that I think are really, really natural. You know, we want to be able to say that there's a way where we can effectively have kind of contracts, right, between different organizations. We want to be able to have a single source of truth across the organization. Like, this is what this data should look like, and how you know, some analytics team uses it, or maybe how a different analytics team uses it, and so forth. So I think there's a really natural kind of progression through additional features that can get added on, and specifically that really help with collaboration and with the kinds of challenges that a bigger organization faces.
I think if we talk about bigger organizations, like we've seen a big rise in governance tooling over the last years.
Yeah.
And I'm making a lot of abstractions here, but what it has been, the core of that mainly has been a library that says, okay, this data source, it comes from this is the person that owns it, and it roughly looks like this. But that is good to know, of course, but you're missing a whole bunch of monitoring aspects. When do we know we cannot trust it anymore? And that has been missing a bit, I think, in the ecosystem, where Great Expectations is playing a very nice role to fill that gap.
Very, very much agree. I you know, I think almost everyone that I talk to has had some library system or other be a part of, leadership has mandated thou shalt go fill in 57 fields in this data library catalog. And okay, so, whatever compliance rate you get with that, people fill in their forms at whatever level of accuracy they can. I mean, let's just assume everybody filled it in perfectly, right? Which I've never been part of an organization where that could happen. But even if it did, the problem is it's immediately out of date. And it's not out of date for a bad reason. Like, that's the irony. It's out of date for a good reason, because the organization is growing and evolving. Right? We wouldn't want data to not change. We want new data sets added and things. And so and it wouldn't be crazy to say, oh, well then, okay, we'll just add people whose job is to update this system. The problem is it's expensive, right? People are your most valuable resource. If we can automate that, if we can really instrument the data directly and make sure that the catalog effectively is updated, the single source of truth of what a data set is and what it looks like and who uses it, and that kind of information is available to people, but is also being built by observing the data itself, then we're just going to provide so much value to teams and be able to do it way less expensively than you'd have to do through this manual data entry process.
So quick, because we have two comments from on the stream. So one of them is, wait, I'm gonna show it. It's just to come back on the experience. So Vikram Maditya Gaonkar is saying, like, from experience, it takes some time to get custom expectations set up correctly. But once they are set up, if something went wrong, I would blame the one who wrote the custom expectation. So I think this comes back a bit from the experience that we were talking about, where like how do we actually set this up and how do we use this, like in between what's the flow when something goes wrong, basically. Yeah,
I think well, there's probably a lot there in that experience, and something I'd love to dive deeper on. Let me just start, like there's a very engineer in me that wants to start by saying probably that also just represents a growth opportunity for Great Expectations. Like if that's the experience in that team. And one of the things that has been one of the biggest priorities for me has been improving the way that we make it possible to write expectations. Mm-hmm. So we did a pretty significant refactor of the internals of Great Expectations, and but we hadn't really it's available. Lots and lots of people are using it, but we hadn't really promoted it to be sort of the primary API yet. And this quarter, that's one of our biggest focus areas, is making we call it the V3 or the batch request API, really the primary one. And I think, I want to, I don't want to presume to know everything that goes on in somebody's comment, but I would imagine that that improvements to how those kind of custom expectations are authored is going to be a big part of how you get to the point where it's not like I assume that it was somebody wrote it wrong, but rather it facilitates a really valuable discussion, right? In much the same way any other expectation does.
Mm-hmm. So on that topic, and then I will come to, because like if some people are watching John Will, I will come to your question, but it's just on that topic. So Fauzi is saying, what do you think? Oh yeah, good point. What do you think should be the approach in case of data drifting, or if the data business field is less predictable?
So I think I'm going to give like a hopefully honest but useful answer that like it depends. How to react if in the case of data drifting. Well, I think that's really a systems question. Great Expectations is providing the insight, but let's just imagine. I mean, I think often when people are talking about data drift, it's in the context of a deployed ML system. And so let's suppose we're talking about a deployed ML system. Well, really what that's going to mean is that if your data is drifting, the question is, what is my appropriate retraining cycle and what's my appropriate validation cycle? And both of those are fundamentally cost questions, right? Like if your job is to predict ballistic trajectory, like you're not going to retrain an ML model over and over again, because fortunately gravity has not changed dramatically in the last 400 years. And we can really accurately predict, where your ball is going to land. On the other hand, like let's suppose you're talking about a social system, or a language model that is trained on slang and jargon, right? Like there's a very, very heavy cost of continual validation and retraining. In both of those cases, the really magical thing that's getting provided by the validations is that feedback loop, and making it very explicit, right? Like I'm a very, very big believer, like no living system exists without feedback. No really valuable system at all exists without feedback. A lot of what we're doing is making it possible to have feedback. So, I think that's really the heart. I think, and what I like your framing here in this question. Like if the field is less predictable, then that means like maybe the right strategy there is that you expect the expectations to be themselves dynamic. One of the things that we're doing right now in the library, and we've actually kind of, again, we're building these features kind of slowly and with community feedback along the way. I say slowly isn't quite the right word. Maybe the right thing is to say is quietly, because I think we're actually moving really quickly. But I'd love to have people engage on this. Is we're adding additional grammar around multi-batch expectations, for example, and really enhancing the way that you use evaluation parameters.
Yeah, because that was the way to do it until today, right? The parameter store, and like basically to store something from a previous batch and then use it in the next one.
Exactly. Yep. Exactly right. And so then the question becomes like quite naturally like, well, maybe what I mean, let's take it out of the realm of great expectations for a second and just kind of talk about statistical process control or other ways that people have dealt with similar problems. You might effectively be running a change point detection model, for example. And in that context, what we want to do is make it so that you can do that in the context of great expectations, right? So that you're not having to add a whole lot of machinery to take advantage of really powerful statistical techniques, and to get that kind of feedback and insight into your system a little bit more easily. One of the things that that this goes to is, I mean, there's some great examples of time series models, for example, and Profit is certainly a popular one of that to think of right now. And one of the things that we haven't released, but that I'm really excited about is doing something around effectively making an expectation on the output of a Profit model. So we can have like a effectively dynamically trained time series model that's looking at and can therefore account for things like seasonality, but also holidays or other kinds of things that would otherwise be noise in a data set. There's great techniques for modeling, and when you really think about what is your business case, it's often, well, I expect that things are kind of like normal, and that's a really powerful thing to be able to say.
Right. So quickly, and then it's just so Vikram just mentioned that he just doesn't want to get wrong. Just that he's really happy about the new modular expectation in V3.
Yeah,
a bit of time to get it working. So that's
yeah.
Maybe one of the questions we got is from John Wells. So, how do you think about DQ supported certification and as attestation for both compliance reasons and general business confidence in metrics and reports? Is this part of the future vision of GE of Great Expectations?
This is a I love this question. Let me go just a second back to this slide and like talk about this kind of like full SaaS, full organization, or cloud, probably a bit more accurate, full organization. When we're talking about like, and data contracts here is in sort of in quotation marks, and enterprise roles, like that's exactly what we're thinking about, is this notion that, different teams, organizations, or inter-organizational relationships can in some ways be mediated and have this very clear, basically certificate that, that the data is as it should be. This is interesting to me because just like if we go way back to the beginning of our conversation, we talked about, data risks and pipeline risks. The same is true in this case, I think, for a lot of different kind of compliance contexts. Compliance is not schematic. It is semantic. And the notion of, you might want to have an expectation about, for example, the distribution, geographic distribution of data elements in a training set. And that kind of thing, I think it opens up a really powerful way of communicating inside an organization. So I would say yes. And, if there are specific problems that you're interested in that space, like because we're starting to be able to, and this in part is just a benefit of being able to have, a team that is, we're now getting, well funded, and we're growing a lot as a team, so we can actually, build a lot more of these kinds of features. So I'd love to have John, you reach out and engage on that and make sure that we can target the cases that you're thinking about.
For what it's worth, how we do it, because we do have this compliance reports that we need to build. Basically, I assume it would be some kind of an expectation suite, and then you would run that, and you would see the report, and you can display it in the way you want or the way you need it.
Yeah, although just as but specifically, I think in a compliance context, you might be needing for like a central organization to say all the teams that are deploying data of this kind, it must be checked against this expectation suite, and then a certification of those results must get sent back to our compliance shop and filed away, and these kinds of things.
So in between, we got two thanks from Fauzi. Thanking you for the feedback control ID, and then John Wills, which apparently will contact you. So that's also a good thing.
Love it.
I think it makes a lot of sense in the context of compliance as well. So how we see, what we sometimes touch upon is like compliance around AI models in the finance sector, where you need to show that there's full traceability. Like an AI model typically is like a function that helps to decide something, and you need to be able to explain how you come to that decision. And there you need to have a full traceability on what sources that this first came from. And typically how you do this without something like Great Expectations is that you describe this whole flow on how we're fetching data here, we're checking this there, but having this expectation suite and having a green check from the moment that there is actually an inspection is very strong, of course, because it shows that what you're describing, how you do traceability, that you're also actually monitoring it, and you can very quickly see, voilà, this is my protocol around this. Here, check it, because we're actively monitoring this. Very interesting approach to this. John mentions.
So one last one. I mean, there's lots more we can talk about, of course, because we're talking about the V3 API, and I just. Totally, I want to own. Yes, it's been it's not easy migration. It was actually an amazing amount of work on the internals in order to do this re-architecture. But again, I think it provides a huge amount of benefit, and which we've already seen in terms of the ease of being able to contribute expectations conceptually. Now, obviously, it's there's a learning curve there. I also really want to suggest it's also opened up things like a fundamentally new way of doing profiling. So slide credit here, we have, like I mentioned, our team is growing, and one of the things that's meant is we've been able to hire a couple of really awesome engineering managers recently. So, one of them, Ortal Gaffin, joined our team, came in, joined this profiling pod, and put together this kind of like direct comparison of where we were and to where we've come in profiling. And I love kind of the conceptual demonstration here of like what's one of the things you get by having the V3 API, and it's that it's about the way that you can extend profilers in many ways. So now we've provided a vocabulary for you to write rules, not rules of what your data needs to be, but rules for how to look at data and then create expectations from it. And then we're starting to provide a library of standard ones, and in many ways, these are not surprising. Like it's actually very easy to express, kind of typical anomaly detection in terms of these kinds of rules. Like, I want to take a sample of data. I want to look at, run a bootstrapping procedure over it to estimate quantiles and build expectations that way. And that's sort of what's being shown here on the screen is this ability to do these kind of estimates, and therefore set false positive targets, for example, so that you can really tune from the automated profiling perspective at the very beginning, how you would like your system to evolve and learn and kind of get that bootstrapping, no pun intended, but bootstrap your process of building expectations. So anyway, this is to me super exciting in terms of where we're going. There's lots of other things that we're doing right now. One of them is improvements to data docs, that feature, and making it more responsive and beautiful, and also easier to extend with new features. So stand by for more things, more great things to come. And I guess I'm looking at time and thinking, let's do any other questions.
Should I go for the next question? So, and I think this is also one of my big questions because I've seen there. So you showed a slide where you mentioned interactive UI in the second column, as Vikram is also mentioning. And I think it's a bit also my view on it. So far, if I'm not mistaken, the way to write expectations, the easiest way was through Jupyter notebooks. So you would spin up a notebook, interactively run basically expectations on your data, and then save the results at the end. And the question here is how are you basically looking at a way to make this more accessible to more businessy people, which even if it's already quite easy to use the batch.expect something,
it's still code.
It's still code, exactly. So my question is this is whilst easy is still code. So are you looking for the next step to make it even easier?
Yes, and yes. This is where, so we have our head of product is Eugene Mandel. He this is one of his, he is super on point in representing this. And this is something we hear from teams all the time, right? It's I get it. I love the value and it's my team, but the people who have this semantic knowledge that we're talking about, they're often not the people who want to write code. And so sometimes I think on the bullet, we also had this, notion of low code for being able to do expectations. Yes, we've heard that loud and clear. We have a really gifted UX designer who's got some phenomenal designs, and it takes time to get that right. And so yes, and no spoilers yet here, except for to say I'm excited about where we're going to go with that.
You're working on it. They're working on it. Okay, that's what we need to understand there. All right.
Maybe a question because about Superconductive, the company behind Great Expectations. Is there? I'm going to maybe start differently. I've heard the argument, and I don't think it's a good argument, but I've heard the argument saying that we're not going to use Great Expectations because it's an open source tool. And I don't agree with the argument, but it's still an argument that is being used in industry to make decisions on. And I think it's already strong that there is now Superconductive, which is a bit it's in the minds of people, it safeguards there is a company behind this, it's going to be around. the future. Is there also are there ideas around commercial support for like larger companies?
Yeah. Firstly, I share your view on all counts. I mean, I love open source software, and I've been on the other end of that equation. And to be honest, I am very sympathetic to it, right? Like when I was running a larger organization, it just wasn't really an option for me to put an engineer on supporting something. And it's more cost effective to have somebody who really knows the tool really well. I think there's no question, but that the whole of Great Expectations is better because of the community. And, there will always be open source free to use Great Expectations. And yes, I think rather than think of it as a commercial support, the way I would think of it is an even better than that, which is a really a hosted and managed version of Great Expectations. So you can have a cloud deployment. We're building options, that include, the ability to completely isolate your data. Data stays in your environment, never leaves. But you get all of the deployment patterns, the UI, actually some additional features. We've talked about collaboration, other things that we're enabling through what we call clauses. So there's a huge amount of I think value add that we're going to be able to offer by having a commercially available version of Great Expectations. And I think that also does really take away the concern of, do I want to just go in and use an open source tool alone? The other thing I would just flag is, to your point, Superconductive is not going anywhere. And I mentioned at the beginning we're hiring, and it's been really exciting for me that we've recently announced that we've closed a pretty significant fundraising deal that just makes us feel very comfortable that we're going to be able to deliver on the promises and value that Great Expectations has been able to put out into the market.
Right. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah. And of course, another argument here to make is also there's a big community behind Great Expectations, which is also typically something that you take into consideration. And is this a tool that I'm going to use going forward? Which is also impressive. I think I'm looking at it now. There are 4.7K stars at GitHub, which is significant for something that is, still a bit of in a niche field, of course. How do you have specific plans for the community?
Yes, and actually, that's another. I keep saying there's all these areas where I'm excited, and it's because that's all true. Our growth lead is Kyle Eden. He is just gifted at really helping make it accessible for people to join. Right. One of the things we want, if you're a very first job data engineer, you're welcome, right? And you can ask the most basic question about anything you need to in the community, all the way. And then if you want to ask a statistical question, yes, come in. Where we want to go in the community is firstly really ramping up the ability to contribute, and secondly making it easier for people to see how their contributions are impactful. One of the things that we are building right now, and you can actually see kind of the trappings of it in our contrib section of the open source project, where we're starting to have people be able to fill in kind of metadata about their contributed expectation. And we're gonna be able to expose that more broadly on a website, so you'll be able to see, other people liked my expectation. Maybe they're downloading it, and find people who have similar interests and so forth that way. So we also really, and I don't want to make it all sound rosy, right? Frankly, our community support has been a really hard point. It's extremely expensive to do what I'm saying we want to do. We want to make everybody real welcomed, and we're still a tiny team. We're still hiring, so there's been a lot of growing pains. I just have to acknowledge it, right? Like it is what it is. It's hard for me to say, and it's hard to acknowledge because it means I also, haven't gotten to be as responsive as I want to in Slack and to people who come in on the community. So, and we're working hard to address that through hiring and through continuing to support that community really well.
Well, I think it's a good problem to have. Huh?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, fair, absolutely right.
But I mean, just personally, like, because I've been a few times on the Slack myself for a few questions, and like, of course, it's not on the minutes response, but like I've always had answers to my questions. So, I mean, just want to say the community has been very helpful, generally speaking. So that's really nice to see.
Yeah, good to hear.
I don't have any more questions. I mean, I would love to hear more about this Cloud Great Expectations product coming out, but
that's way, James, to follow updates on Great Expectations or Superconductive.
So the best way is to join our Slack, and you'll see Kyle in there. He is doing a lot in terms of really advertising events and making announcements about things that are coming up and growing. And that's that. So I'd say like start in Slack, ask questions from there. And that's the right way to see how things are going. And then, as you get more engaged, like we'd love to see you making contributions on GitHub, right? Like we'd love to see new features or bug reports. That's valuable too.
Right. Cool. Anything left that you want to share?
No, I think that's it for me. I'm realizing I think we do have more time on the schedule, in which case I'm happy to talk a little bit more about other features, but I also feel like we've really done a great job kind of covering over things. And so this has just been a great conversation.
Okay. Then, thanks a lot. We will make sure to share the details where people can follow updates.
Yep.
Thanks. It was very interesting. And I would say everybody keep tuned for the next Through the Tools, which will be on Streamlit, which is a framework to very easily build interactive Python, data-driven Python applications. Thanks a lot, James, and to everybody. See you next time.
See you next time. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.